My wife stepped on something in the lake. The next day, they found a body. A few years ago, when my daughter was a toddler, my wife and I used to take her to a nearby lake to picnic, swim, and just unwind. It was a peaceful spot, quiet, not too crowded, the kind of place where you could easily forget about the world for a while. One afternoon, after we'd finished eating, my wife decided to go for a quick swim while I stayed on the beach with our daughter. I watched her wade out into the water. The sun sparkled off the surface. A minute later, she suddenly stopped and turned to me, shouting something. At first, I couldn't make out what she said, but her expression was off. Then I heard her clearly. I think I just stepped on someone's face. I froze for a second, thinking maybe she was joking, but the look on her face wasn't playful. It was pale, almost disenchanted. She started quickly making her way back to the shore, her legs moving faster, like she couldn't get out of the water fast enough. When she got back to me, she was visibly shaken. She said that while she was swimming, her foot brushed against something soft, and at first, she thought it was a rock or a weird patch of seaweed. But when she pressed her foot down, she felt the unmistakable shape of a face beneath the water, a nose, an eye socket. She swore she felt the hollow of the eye. I considered going in to check it out, but something stopped me. The unease in my gut, maybe. We decided to pack up and leave right after that. The next day, the local news reported that a young boy who had been missing for days was found drowned in that same lake, not far from where we had been. He'd been there the whole time, just beneath the surface. To this day, my wife is convinced she stepped on his face. The call of the lake. It happened in my old apartment near a large, dark lake. I was 8 years old, living with my parents and my older brother, John, who was 15. That weekend, my friend Lena, who was 13, stayed over. It was late one night, around 11 p.m., when John suggested we try to communicate with a ghost. Lena and I, filled with curiosity, agreed to try it. The ritual, as John called it, required us to wait until midnight. We would place a plate on the floor, set a candle in the center, arrange letters of the alphabet around the edge, and allow the candle's flame to move to point at letters as the ghost's way of speaking to us. As we gathered everything we needed, I remember my dad, the only adult still awake, noticed what we were up to. With a slight, eerie smile, he warned, "Be careful. Sometimes, spirits overstay their welcome." He told me to have fun, but his words gave me a strange, uneasy feeling. We set up in John's room, placing the plate and the letters on the floor. At midnight, we closed the windows and door, lit the candle, and held each other's hands. We whispered the summoning words a few times and waited. To our surprise, the candle flame began to flicker and shift slightly. We took turns asking basic questions, and the spirit seemed to answer by pointing the flame at letters. Now, I can't say for sure if John or Lena was subtly blowing to make the flame move, but as a young kid, I was mesmerized. Then things got darker. John, likely wanting to up the stakes, asked, "Do you want to harm us?" The flame pointed to yes. The three of us went silent. Suddenly, a strange, bright green glow appeared outside the window. To give you context, the window in John's room faced the lake, and at night it was pitch black out there. There were no street lights or anything that would create that kind of light. Drawn to the glow, I found myself standing and walking to the window, completely captivated by it. The world around me went silent. I could no longer hear my brother's or Lena's frantic whispers. Through the glass, I saw the source of the light, a sunken fishing boat in the middle of the lake. It was partially submerged, with only the bow and part of the cockpit visible, while a rusted hook jutted out of the back. Oddly, the boat was covered in an eerie green coral, which seemed to be emitting the glow. The scene felt frozen in time, like an image from another world. I was too mesmerized to feel any fear. My trance broke when John abruptly turned on the bedroom light, snapping me back to reality. Instantly, the lake outside was plunged back into darkness. I was furious with John for interrupting the vision, demanding he turn off the light again. He shrugged, switched it off, and he and Lena went to put everything back in the kitchen. leaving me alone in the room. I stared out the window for a while, hoping to see the glow again, but it was gone forever, I suppose. I kept that night to myself for years, almost unsure if it really happened. Years later, I asked John about it, and he remembered the night, but he claimed there had been no green light outside. He only recalled me staring out the window in silence, as if I couldn't even hear him. House by the lake. As I gazed at the bungalow that would be our home for the next 3 months, I felt a flicker of excitement. My wife, Marcy, had found the property on Airbnb and was immediately captivated by it. Though recently renovated, the bungalow retained an old-world charm. Nestled on a secluded strip of land by a small lake, it was far removed from the hum of city life. The nearest neighbors were over a mile away. If not for the constant birdsong, the eerie silence would have been overwhelming. The thick canopy of trees and the earthy scent of the soil seemed like the perfect cure for my writer's block. As a horror writer, I was eager to soak in the ambience, hoping it might stir some inspiration. Our 7-year-old daughter, Stella, shrieked with joy upon spotting an old swing in the backyard and dashed toward it. She was the light of our lives. After a decade of marriage and years of hoping, her arrival had saved not only our relationship, but had also helped us form a close-knit family. As I watched her swing, my eyes were drawn to an old well in the far corner of the yard. Something about it felt off. I walked over and placed my hand on its weathered stone wall, peering down into its depths. A faint, sour odor wafted up, and a strange sensation prickled the back of my neck. I felt as though some unseen force was pulling me toward it, drawing me into the dark abyss. A sudden thud jolted me back. I turned to see Stella on the ground, crying after a fall from the swing. Marcy and I rushed over, helping her up and cleaning her scraped knees. As she sniffled, Marcy removed her moon-shaped locket and slipped it around Stella's neck, a comforting gesture that seemed to calm her. That locket was Marcy's only link to her past. An orphan herself, she'd spent her childhood in a string of foster homes, each one leaving her more determined to create a loving family of her own. She cherished the locket through every hardship, so seeing her share it with Stella was touching. Just then, an elderly man in overalls appeared at the edge of the yard, his eyes fixed on Stella, or rather on the locket around her neck. Assuming he was the caretaker, I introduced myself and asked for directions to the nearest clinic. He muttered something about a local clinic 2 miles east, but his gaze remained locked on Stella until we drove away. As we returned from the clinic later that night, exhaustion setting in, the caretaker was standing by the entrance, as though waiting for us. I wanted to speak with him too. I had so many questions, but it was late, and we were all tired, so I told him we'd talk tomorrow. He nodded, though reluctantly. After putting Stella to bed, Marcy and I turned in, and I fell asleep almost instantly. Sometime later, I was woken by a faint, muffled sound coming from outside the bedroom. I tried to ignore it, but the noise persisted, burrowing into my mind. Reluctantly, I got up and made my way toward the living room. As I approached, I saw a figure at the base of the staircase. A pale, spectral woman, hunched over, her back turned to me. Her soft, despairing sobs filled the room. The figure slowly turned, and I felt my blood run cold. She was cradling what appeared to be the lifeless body of my daughter, Stella, her ghostly tears falling as she rocked back and forth. I blinked, and in an instant, I was jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat. I stumbled out of bed, racing down the hall to Stella's room. Relief washed over me when I saw her sleeping soundly, just as we had left her. But the dream lingered in my mind, each detail vivid and horrifying. The pale woman, her tears, and that moon-shaped locket clutched tightly in her hand. Panic struck me again. I rushed back to our room, only to find Marcy missing. A glance out the window revealed her walking toward the well, as if in a trance. And beside her, barely visible in the darkness, was the ghostly woman from my dream. She was gesturing frantically, as if to stop Marcy from moving closer to the well. Desperately, I dashed outside. By the time I reached them, Marcy was already climbing up the well's ledge, her gaze fixed on the darkness below. I whispered her name softly, trying not to startle her. She didn't respond, so I took a steadying breath and slowly reached out, pulling her down just as she stepped forward. We fell back onto the grass, and I held her tightly, trembling. Marcy's eyes blinked open. "Alex, where are we?" she asked, confused. I tried to reassure her, and as I looked around, I caught sight of the ghostly figure standing nearby, watching us. She seemed almost relieved. "Are you her mother?" I asked the apparition, and she nodded. Marcy, unable to see her, looked at me with a mix of confusion and worry. Back inside, once Marcy had fallen back to sleep, the ghost appeared again, gesturing for me to follow. She led me to an old book on a shelf in the living room. Inside was a newspaper clipping with a family photo. Marcy, barely 4 years old, sat on the lap of a woman I recognized as the ghost. Her name was Emily. Behind them was a man with a menacing look, identified as Robert Givens, a wealthy but abusive man who had discovered Marcy was not his daughter. According to the clipping, Robert, in a fit of rage, had tried to throw young Marcy into the well. In the struggle, both Robert and Emily had died. The next day, Marcy was found unconscious near the well and was taken to an orphanage, the locket her only link to her past. As I looked up, Emily's spirit gave me a sad, grateful smile. Then a question dawned on me. Who was Marcy's real father? Emily pointed across the yard to the caretaker's quarters. Stunned, I realized the caretaker had likely known about Marcy all along. He must have come to this place, desperate to be close to her, haunted by his inability to protect his family. But what do I do with this knowledge? Marcy has finally found happiness after years of pain. She has her own family now, and the memory of her past, buried for so long, has finally faded. How can I bring up a ghostly mother she can't see, a father she never knew, and a traumatic past she's better off without? The questions swirl in my mind, heavy with doubt, and yet the truth remains. What do I do? The Lake of Oblivion. Long ago, before my mother and I moved to another continent, I left something both beautiful and terrifying behind in my native village. A magnificent blue lake surrounded by rocks, known only as the Lake of Oblivion. This lake was infamous for luring people in, tempting anyone who saw it to draw close, touch its waters, or even take a dip. But for the villagers, the lake was something far darker, a kind of executioner. Any person or object deemed troublesome or unworthy would be cast into the lake, to be claimed by an unseen entity known as Oblivion. Justice was swift, and once taken by the lake, nothing ever returned. Every disappearance became a ritualized affair. The villagers believed that Oblivion would sometimes leave behind a memento of its victims, an item of remembrance, which would float back to the shore. Only a witch doctor could retrieve it, for it was said that even a single touch of the water would mean one's own disappearance. Each item had the rumored power to retrieve its associated person or object from Oblivion, but the task was so dangerous that no one dared to attempt it. I lived in that village with my older brother, Oljuven, and our mother, Sildel. Life was peaceful until the day tragedy struck our family. One day, when I was 13, I noticed Oljuven was unusually quiet, troubled even. When I asked him why, he said he'd soon be leaving for a distant place and handed me his favorite toy, a small yellow plastic car he had loved as a child. Later that day, as the sun set, village warriors came to our home. They surrounded our house and arrested Oljuven, who went without a fight. He was accused of stealing an item of remembrance and performing a forbidden retrieval. When my mother and I went to his trial before the village elders, the accusation left us in shock. Not long ago, a wounded foreigner had staggered into our village, carrying a black bag stuffed with foreign banknotes. She died from her injuries soon after, and her money was declared cursed and thrown into the Lake of Oblivion. But the lake left a single banknote behind as the item of remembrance, a banknote that Oljuven was accused of stealing. While they claimed he'd done it for greed, I knew my brother had a good heart, and I was sure there was more to his actions. As tradition dictated, Alyuvin's sentence was carried out at night. The head of the village, our mother, myself, and a handful of witnesses, including my mother's friend Remja, gathered around the lake, for which doctors chanted, painting strange symbols on Alyuvin's chest with a dark, pungent liquid. My mother and I cried as they bound him and placed him in a small boat with one of the witch doctors, who paddled out to the lake's center. There, he carefully set Alyuvin into the water, along with the banknote he had taken, without letting his hands touch the lake. As the boat returned, the water began to bubble, and a strange light glowed beneath my brother. He started to tremble, and as the glow intensified, he shouted, "I shall return! I shall return!" The witch doctor reached the shore just as Oblivion's cyan light filled the lake, and with one final scream, Alyuvin was pulled under, leaving nothing but stillness. No item of remembrance appeared, and the villagers saw this as a judgment. Alyuvin's retrieval was a crime so vile that he would not be granted a chance to return. Weeks passed, and my mother and I were haunted by grief and nightmares. Every night, I dreamed I was at the lake's shore, seeing Alyuvin's head calling to me from the water, begging for freedom, until monstrous tentacles would rise from the depths, scaring me awake. Months later, the nightmares eased, but one night, I gathered the courage to confront my fears. I went to the lake, bringing the yellow car my brother had given me. The moonlight danced on the water, and the village, fearful of oblivion, kept its distance. A boat was waiting for me, as if prepared by fate. I tied a rope to my waist and anchored it to a rock on shore, then paddled out to the lake's center. Unsure of what to do, I took out the yellow toy car and tossed it into the water. "Please, Alyuvin," I whispered, "come back to us," but my plea was answered with violent thrashing. Something struck the boat, sending waves rocking me from side to side. I clung to the boat, terrified, as it struck again and again. I lay still, clutching the boat, until the pounding stopped and a cyan glow illuminated the water beneath me. Breath heavy, I froze as a hand, pale blue with black nails, gripped the edge of the boat, then another. I held my breath, and then a head rose. Dark hair, a pale blue face, and glowing green eyes stared into mine. The creature resembled Alyuvin, but I knew it was not him. Panicking, I scrambled, and with one swift motion, I was pulled into the water, struggling between two opposing forces. I barely remember how, but my mother's hands pulled me back from the lake, and I collapsed, exhausted, in her arms. The next morning, we fled the village with Remja's help, slipping away while the villagers were distracted by something strange happening at the lake. Later, Remja told us that the lake's waters had begun to overflow, spreading into the village itself. She severed all ties with us after that, for reasons she never explained. Now, as an adult, I still don't know what happened to the village, or if the lake even exists anymore. I wonder if my actions might have brought disaster upon them, or how my mother managed to win a struggle against a force like oblivion. And sometimes, I wonder if that creature was truly my brother or simply something that wore his face. In a way, Alyuvin lives on in our hearts and memories, but, for me, he's still there in my nightmares, forever trapped in the lake.